Welcome to Aspen Ignites, Conversations to Build a Better World, a series from the Aspen Institute that brings together thoughtful people with diverse backgrounds and points of view. In this episode, Ozina Wanevu, contributing editor at The New Republic, discusses the risks and rewards of deep dialogue with Samuel Kimbriel, founding executive director of the Aspen Institute's Philosophy and Society program.
Great to chat with you, Sam, as always. So you write a lot in your work about how thinkers today, from your perspective, are afraid to take certain risks. They leave certain concepts underexplored, underexamined. I don't know, I've enjoyed that about your writing a lot.
Yeah.
What drove you to sort of start thinking about that problem?
Well, it's great to see you, and this is a conversation you and I have been having for 3 or 4 years together, and I think the concerns that we'll bring up are very much shared. So I would say that, first of all, something kind of biographical, which is I spent my 20s sort of in the opposite way from most of our friends, which involves just hiding myself away in a library, reading books.
That's also what I did.
Yeah, okay, well, reasonable, yeah.
Yeah. You have strange friends.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and all kinds of books, like allowed my curiosity to dictate in every kind of direction. And what I found then moving more into public sphere conversation is that it's actually significantly more tame than anything that I was encountering in that kind of library setting. And it's tame, I think, in a couple of ways. One, it feels like it's very self-focused. So there's a lot of emphasis on kind of social posturing and where you sit within a particular ideological map. And then it's secondly tame in the sense of the size of the questions people are asking. So people will argue with like great verve about the latest kind of like small policy question that you get, and almost never discuss anything about what it's about, what it's for, what kind of life we're actually talking about. And so I've grown increasingly confident that the way that I spent my 20s was better than this other version that we've seen, and excited about trying to think, what could you do to prompt much more of this kind of, it's, one way I think about it is if you pick up like one of the books that I had from that period, there's so much blood in it. Like it's full of life and vitality and joy and human emotion and rage sometimes and frustration. In contrast, I think if you pick up almost anything that's being published at any of our big outlets, it has a kind of bloodlessness to it. There's a kind of willingness to use jargon and just defer the kinds of questions that people are actually like really feeling.
Yeah. I mean, I see this a lot in my field too. I mean, I'm a journalist, obviously, and an opinion journalist. So I'm allowed to have more blood in my writing than I think most journalists are. But I even I have sort of felt often now that the public discourse is limited in the ways that you've described, and limited for journalists. And I guess I'd say 2 ways. So like one, it's the ephemerality of the work. You write something, you put it out there, you put all of your time into it, and somebody reads it over their lunch break, and they're mad about something for like 5 minutes, or they're thinking thoughtfully about something for 5 minutes, but then it kind of goes away. And it just feels like the medium doesn't lend itself often to enduring conversations about large topics. And that's the second thing. Like you write these stories and you write about the issues that are really important, but it often feels like the background concepts underpinning why the issue is important are kind of under discussed. And I felt this way specifically about democracy, which is a big word right now. Obviously a huge topic of political conversation and discussion, and it should be. But I'd write these pieces about the Democratic Party and what they wanted to do once they got Congress and the White House, and all of the structural hurdles that they would face and all the structural hurdles that existed in the system. And people report about this very well, but it was always like, you're writing the same thing over and over and over again without asking, why does this hurdle exist? Like, is it good?
It's like, do we really need like one more piece about like the mechanics of the filibuster?
Right. I've written like 60 of them, and I wasn't going to write another one. So I needed to figure out something else to do. And so what I decided to do instead was to go on a little bit of a break and work on a book project about democracy. Just sort of getting into that question. Okay, what is democracy actually? We use that word a lot. Do we really know what it means? Is there like a coherent reality there to the concept as it exists in our minds? And in doing that, I realized that I didn't know as much about democracy as I thought I did. I had some of my own preconceptions challenged, and the project was valuable for that. Like it was this process of intellectual rediscovery and delving deep into something that we all take for granted as a concept, partially because the discourse has these issues you've talked about. It's kind of flat. You're not encouraged to delve that deeply into any particular thing on like a conceptual level. But you know, we could have different conversations. I think that's kind of what you're hoping to spark with your work at Aspen.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, to talk about democracy for a second, one thing, people talk a lot about the lack of health in our democracy currently, and there are definitely problems. I often do think, though, if you were to compare what we have, which is a context and a population with a great deal of feeling, like what you see not just on social media when you log in, but also like over Thanksgiving dinner, is a lot of people that actually care very deeply about life. And if you compare that to a society that is kind of listless and anemic, I actually think America is a very exciting kind of context and case. I think what we don't have is context where we can express that feeling well and honestly and directly and with a kind of feistiness that it actually deserves. And I would love to, I mean, we should talk a little bit about the kinds of context that can happen. One thing that I always feel is that when you ask someone what they feel about taxing policy, you will get like one very specific kind of answer. And you will get, on the one hand, kind of very technical apparatus from people who all went to graduate school. And then on the other hand, a kind of like eyes glazed over, just generalized frustration for most other people. I think in contrast, if you ask people, what is the meaning of life and what is the meaning of your life, suddenly you get intense feeling and honestly like rage, frustration, joy, all kinds of things spill out. And those strike me as philosophical questions. And they're actually much, much harder questions than the tax policy question. And so finding context where we can press people or offer them the venue for asking much larger questions rather than more tame ones is one of the things that I really care about.
Yeah, and I think those questions are democratic questions too.
That's right.
I mean, one of the cases that people make against democracy is that if you were to ask somebody a tax policy question, an ordinary person, they wouldn't be able to say much of value, much utility. And therefore, we should be looking for ways to actually restrict the franchise or exclude certain people from the vote. And my response to this is that those questions, beyond the technocratic aspects of them, are questions about values that everybody does have. Everybody does have something to say about the values that are reflected in a tax code or a budget.
Well, like just to make it concrete, what we're talking about with tax policy is one of two possible things. In many cases, it's, do you want less involvement from external social structures and just get on with your American notion of freedom? Or do you want it to be the case that like when something goes wrong, someone is there for you? And that is a real human question. And you can understand that people have different views about it, but it's not abstract or bloodless. It's something that has intense feeling around it. And it makes sense to be able to have ways to talk about it honestly. Why do people feel this, like, we're in Colorado, like that couple valleys over, there are a whole bunch of people who feel this desire to not ever talk to anyone from New York ever again in their lives. And why? How does that come about? What is the feeling? And on the other hand, I mean, I feel incredibly grateful. I spent my 20s in the UK and incredibly grateful for the feeling like you can take big risks actually, because like that if something goes wrong, there's a large medical system that can handle that. And those are strong feelings for me. And being able to allow those things on the page seems to me like incredibly essential actually.
Yeah, and on the page and in everyday conversation to the extent that that's possible. It's just a matter of giving people the right tools to feel like they have the permission to start engaging with these concepts more than they already do.
Let me ask you a question. So it seems like we're in a moment of real turmoil, political turmoil, but also media level turmoil. Both a lot of publications kind of going through internal layoffs, social media is undergoing big shifts. if you were to see, so I mean, you talked a little bit about your frustration with journalism. I can say a couple more things about my frustration with academia as well if we want to. But on the journalistic side, if you were to see that ecosystem alter in some kind of way within the next few years, like what kind of public conversation would you want to have? How would that look different for you?
Oh, I'm glad this wasn't the question of how do we fix
No,
newspapers
definitely not.
or magazines, because I do not have an answer to that question. But
No, I think it's a substantive question.
Yeah,
like, what are we going to be as a public?
Yeah, like, I mean, I would like to see. I mean, it is kind of unfortunately a business question too. I mean, that's part of it. Like, we have this information infrastructure now, this journalistic infrastructure now, where the thing you want to do is to get as many people to read your thing as possible. It should be engaging and snappy in like a reliable way.
I mean, the thing that I was thinking about the like previous iteration of our media ecosystem is this is like an old human phenomena, which is basically gladiator games. Like we get that like indignation and frustration and sort of contest and violence can attract a lot of people to come and watch your show. That's an old.
Yeah, it's an old problem. I mean, even within the journalistic context, I mean, Walter Lippmann in 1922 wrote this book, Public Opinion, that could have been written yesterday. And he complains about how nobody really wants to pay for their newspaper. They expect the news for free. People are attracted to sensationalism, these dumb stories that sell papers, move papers in New York City or wherever. So like these are long-standing problems. And I'm not sure that I have the solution. But what I'd like to see is journalists and editors realizing that there is actually a public appetite for deeper conversations. There are examples of pieces in the last 10, 15 years that I think have done the work of actually really breaking down an issue, not just in a kind of wonky way, but getting at some kind of deeper philosophical meaning behind the issue in question. So I think a lot about the case for reparations, the Ta-Nehisi Coates piece in The Atlantic some years ago, which did, I think, everything that you want journalism to do, at least from my perspective. So it was a detailed historical account of redlining, talked about the history of slavery, interviews, all of that kind of granular stuff. But he was engaging with history in a way that I don't think journalists are often encouraged to do because it takes too long. He was trying to get at the meaning of an important part of the American experience in a way that I don't think journalists are often encouraged to because it takes too long. And it's too involved.
Well, and it's also scary. I mean, it is, I think that part of my argument for intellectual risk, like the idea that we live in a tame intellectual culture, is that in fact, as soon as you start like reading hard books, your whole world gets disoriented. Like the feeling of what the structure of life is, what it means, why you're doing what you're doing, gets a little bit jumbled up, and that can be a disconcerting experience. But I think the point is that it's possible to go through that experience and then come to a much more vital and robust and lively kind of picture of life.
And it sells magazines too. I mean, that was the punchline of the whole thing.
This is so kind of to answer the question that we're discussing. I mean, my view is actually the opposite, which I think there are immense audiences for deeper thinking. And this is the reason that so many people are interested in Jordan Peterson. And the sort of Joe Rogan. I mean, Joe Rogan has 12 million subscribers or something, whatever. I think that the feeling is people actually really do want things outside that are able to pull them into questions that they themselves feel disconcerted by on Thursdays. And figuring out how you can offer that version, I think, is really valuable.
A healthy.
That's right.
Version of that. There's a deep and abiding curiosity in people in general. People want to know what gives their life meaning. They want to explain things that have happened to them to themselves in a certain way, and that's why people turn to art and fiction. In other ways, that's why they turn to Joe Rogan. But there's always this hunger to understand experience that I don't think we really cater to in the current media environment. And it's a bigger problem than any one person can solve that maybe institutions can work on.
We should talk about our salon a little bit. So in DC, we met at a Super Bowl party of all places, and then talked about some of these same things that we just discussed. And then we set up this group that pulls in people from very wide ideological perspectives, like far right to left.
Not that far right, but
medium right. Medium right. That sounds right.
Right.
And in that context, normally in Washington, what happens is that people pull back into their talking points.
Yeah.
And part of what we've done, first of all, is not go for consensus. Like, we don't want people to agree at the end of this thing.
Right.
But we do want people to be able to ask a question that's deeper than their day jobs.
Yeah.
And it's been really interesting. I mean, I'd be interested in kind of we've been running it for 3 years now, and I'd be interested in your sense about how that's gone.
Yeah, I think it's gone really well. I mean, I think that projects like this are often pitched as something that will get people, like you said, to agree at the end.
Yeah.
You sit
Talk
at a
across
table,
divides.
you talk across divides, you
Yeah.
sit people from different perspectives down at a table, and you realize at the end of it, you actually had more in common than
Yeah,
you thought in
yeah,
the first place.
yeah.
And that's actually not been our experience. I mean, sometimes
exactly.
that's true. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes the value in it is actually like, no, I better understand
Yeah.
what the nature of this divide is. I've now clarified my own position.
Yeah.
And maybe I even feel strongly about it than I did before, but it's open. Look,
But
we're not prefiguring any outcome.
One thing we do is like sustain conversation though. So like we make people debate one word for a whole year.
Yeah.
Which does force people out of their comfort zone, I think.
Yeah. But being forced and being asked to really kind of test your ideas in this crucible that is civil. Nobody's punched each other out yet.
That's true. Not yet. There have been tense moments though.
Yeah, of course. But we welcome that because I think we trust the people who are involved. We know what it's about, and you know we're not afraid of tension. I think that's important. Like in a society as diverse as the United States is, where we tell ourselves that the important thing about this country is that you can really believe what you want to believe, say what you want to say. The hope for consensus amidst all that is actually kind of thin to me.
Yeah.
It always has been.
Yeah.
My conception of democracy, especially now that I've spent the last couple of years thinking about it, is one where you basically concede that there are always going to be these kind of irresolvable differences between different groups of people. People come to their ideologies in ways that you can't necessarily penetrate by writing an article or making a good speech. You know, it's more complicated than that, more inaccessible to the outside influence. So there are going to be these differences, but we need to find ways of expressing them, articulating them, debating them, without telling ourselves that the point is consensus, but also that don't devolve into violence and whatever. Like that's a key task of a society like the United States.
But I mean, I think back to the main theme here. For me, so I think there's one flawed way to do that people often talk about in America, which is that okay, we want to pull back from contentious issues.
Right.
We want to have a fairly neutral public sphere.
Yeah.
The model should be economists doing boring things with spreadsheets.
Right.
Not what I think. I have basically
to do away with politics.
Right. I have
basically.
exactly the opposite view, which is the way that you have a healthy society is to ask the largest and most contentious questions and to do it well. And the reason is because people will always feel intensely about all of those things.
Yeah.
And the capacity not only to give them like resources from people who went to graduate school to ask those questions, but more just to give them legitimacy. Like they do actually feel intense things and figuring out a way that, like what we've done in DC, but that can happen like in normal life in all kinds of contexts with your families, friends, like figuring out what does it mean to speak directly, even with people you know it's going to be there's going to be big disagreement about what your life means and why you care about these things and how you would want to see the society build. Yeah.
I just think there's just room for more maturity about all that.
Right,
I mentioned Lippmann before. So Public Opinion is a book that is deeply, deeply influenced me in a lot of ways. I think it is so insightful about how the way that journalism works, the way the media works, the way that information dissemination works in society. And the last quarter of it is absolutely terrible. Because Lippmann says that the way that you actually solve society's problems, the way that you actually account for these differences or sort of deal with them, is to do exactly what you were talking about. So take politics out of the question. You have these teams of experts in Washington who are going to research every question to the T. They're going to find the most efficient solution. And 9 times out of 10, they're just going to do whatever they think is best. And then on the 10th time, they're going to put something to the public in like an up or down kind of vote. And the decision will already be kind of preordained. Not only is that like impracticable, but I just think that it's so evasive. And I feel like I see that mentality in a lot of places in journalism now, like the idea that, you know, politics is too contentious, we're too divided. What we need are sort of these common sense kind of solutions, these technocratic solutions that some experts have kind of come down on. You'll read this explainer, this is exactly what, we're afraid of politics.
I mean, like it's an aristocracy by other means, and at least the old aristocrats were vaguely entertaining. Like these are like the most boring of all possible aristocrats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel this way, especially with the polarization discourse, actually. You know, and you see this even in political science papers, where the premise of a paper will be that extremism in and of itself is bad. Polarization in and of itself is bad, something to be avoided. We need to design systems and evaluate systems on the basis of how well they deal with extremism and polarization. I think that there are a lot of negative aspects of polarization, obviously. But if you were around in 1890, the idea that women should vote is actually like a deeply polarizing opinion, a very extreme opinion, actually. The idea that African Americans deserve rights is a very polarizing opinion. I just to sort of swear off parts of our discourse because they are outside the mainstream, or the idea is expressed in a certain way. It's expressed with a lot of passion and a lot of blood, like you were saying before. I think is, again, not a really mature way to deal with the reality of diversity and difference in the United States. You can't shove these things aside. There is no technical solution.
I think that's right.
To the problem of difference.
I think that's the thesis. I mean, I think the core point is that there's no way to solve this technically. You have to only solve it humanly, and the capacity to do that means actually having to deal with each other like right where we are. Yeah.
So, Sam, you have this new program that you're involved in at Aspen. I've heard bits and pieces of it, but you should give me the whole spiel.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth saying, like, part of this has come out of our own friendship and conversations, which has been great. Yeah, so the new program is called Philosophy and Society, and its goal is to figure out how you could open up a much more ambitious intellectual register in American public conversation. And in particular, that it allows us to have a kind of humanity. When you pick up the New York Times, so often you like flip open and it's like a Paul Krugman column that has like some charts in it and some stuff about inflation. And like what we want is the capacity to open up the New York Times and it says things that are human, like deeply felt, and has this kind of emotion and blood to it, like we've been discussing. And so I think our interest is both like behind the scenes, like to be able to build kind of venues like what you and I have been doing, these kind of places where people can get down to deep and contentious issues, but then also to create external venues where people are able to write and think and feel about these things. And it's been a really exciting and rewarding thing so far. And the possibility of, I think, legitimating the sense that people have big and real questions that they want to answer in public feels to me really thrilling. So,
I mean, it's always great to talk with you.
Likewise.
Here, especially in beautiful Aspen.
Yeah, beautiful Aspen. Yeah.
Good to see you.
Yeah, great to see you.